Good morning, everyone. We are continuing with our study of the Festival of Light, a Festival of Light, Ananda's Festival of Light. I'll speak to that subject in just a moment, but let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, Friend and Guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence within our hearts, to know that you are our dearest and closest friend, and that everything we do in this world is guided and blessed by that inner presence. Help us to live as we are meant to live, joyfully, selflessly, and in the freedom of thy love. Om, peace. Amen. Today is Monday, and Monday is Money Day, because this work that I've been doing all my life is now being wonderfully supported by so many of you. And it just makes me so happy every single time I see a donation come in or receive a letter or an email from any of you, just speaking of what fun it is to be doing this together. And I really want to express my happiness in that fact. On our YouTube channel, we are up to 9,980 subscribers. So if you know 19 other people and haven't yet subscribed, we can crack through 10,000, and then I won't have to talk about it again for quite a while. The Spanish edition of Lightbearer has been printed. The Italian edition of Lightbearer is being distributed, and that's all because of the generosity of you. So if you feel to contribute, Patreon, go to the Patreon website, a great system for regular support of creative people by people with resources. Or you can go through PayPal, missionofthemasters@gmail.com on PayPal, and happy to have you donate that way. Or go to my website, Asha Joy. So now on with the Festival of Light. I've received emails from two different people with comments that I just wanted to share here that seem worth saying, and I don't want to lose them. The first one was the question, which I spent some time on earlier, about the fact that Swami called it a Festival of Light instead of the Festival of Light, because a Festival of Light, light cannot belong to anyone. You may claim relationship to a certain master, you may claim a certain teaching as definable, but light itself is the foundation of the universe. So a festival of light has to just be light itself. Swamiji does, as you'll see as we go through this, bring this down to a specific focus in the line of masters that we're dedicated to. But the fundamental celebration is the celebration of the descent of light, not the fact that it's come in this form as the definition of that light. So my friend also suggested that self-evidently this is going to be Ananda's Festival of Light, or the Festival of Light through Swami Kriyananda. And when the planet is covered with little festivals of light, then the distinction will become important. And in the meantime, the non-sectarian, expansive intention of Swami Kriyananda should be noted and respected and not lost sight of, even as things may become more defined as the years go by. It's very important, as best we can, to always know what the basic principle is. And then even if we stretch out from that principle and end up somewhere else, like Ananda's Festival of Light, we still know it's just Ananda's Festival of Light. It's not the only Festival of Light, it's just the one that we love, because that's the way life is. Life breaks down into little families, and you have your children and your uncles and your aunts and your grandmothers It doesn't mean that there are no other grandmothers and uncles and children in the world. It just means these are the ones that Divine Mother has sent to me. And the other point that was raised, which is an important point, is that the Festival of Light is presided over in the context of Ananda by designated ordained ministers and light bearers. Light bearers are given a special responsibility, which is to be themselves transmitters of the light. And when we perform this ritual in a public setting, and as you'll see when we get to the last pages, if you haven't seen it before, the light bearer, which is a specially designated clergy in our context, invites those who feel so inclined. It even is put that way. We invite all of you who feel so inclined, which is to say, you don't have to, it's just if you want to come and receive the touch of light from the masters. Then the light bearer holds the candle, draws the light symbolically, and then with using the forefinger of the right hand, touches the devotee at the spiritual eye, and there's a belief that there's a transmission of that light. It's a special responsibility Swamiji assigned to certain people because he felt they had the capacity to do it, and they felt, and this is also important, that it would be spiritually beneficial to them and not spiritually harmful for them to do that. And the reason I put in the harmful is that one has to have a certain mature understanding of what it is to be a channel and not get confused as to what the source of that light is, what the implications might be for the light bearer personally. There's just a degree of care that needs to be exercised in that. That doesn't mean that no one can bless someone else. Parents can bless their children, spouses can bless each other. It's just all of these, we can all be channels for the light, but some situations we have to be aware of the energy that comes to you when you're in that situation, and it's helpful if those who have a greater insight into each other's character can help manage that for everyone's best well-being. Spiritual ego is a very dangerous thing, and you never want to put yourself or others in the position where they might be susceptible to that. As Swami said, it's the hardest kind of ego to overcome because there's a real reason for pride. If you've actually come to a certain understanding spiritually, that's an enduring reality. And if that gets involved with the contractive nature of human personality and human ego, it's not helpful. However, that doesn't mean that the Festival of Light is an esoteric document. And I might have said this earlier. If by any chance some of you are listening to this who've never heard this before, you can go onto any of the Ananda channels, including Ananda Palo Alto, and just click on a Sunday service when it's not just my own Sunday messages are extracted out of the service, but on Facebook and I believe on live stream, I'm not certain of that live stream, you can find the whole service and you can just watch the festival, which is to say it's not an esoteric document. It's not protected. Anybody could transcribe it or replay that recording. And so therefore, it's also possible for you to read this and perform it for yourself. You can have this on your own. And in many of our smaller meditation groups where there is no light bearer in residence, the ministers there will simply read the festival and do the service themselves. When it comes time for the blessing, what we do is what is often done in India. In India, when there's an arati, which is when you offer elements to the altar, which we do as part of this festival with a candle, if light is offered, which it always is, in the form of flame of some kind, then that flame is carried around the room so that all those who are present for the ceremony, and then they themselves take the light into themselves. This is the way it's been done forever, since ancient times. And so if someone is not in a position where it has been recommended that they be the light bearer, they just offer the light like this and everyone takes the light. So there's many ways that you can work with this. Of course, you shouldn't treat this casually. This is not something for a cocktail party. This is not something just to be doing raucously. This is a sacred event, and it should always be carried out in an attitude of reverence with a deep regard for the sacred nature of it. But it's beautiful, it's powerful, and it's available. So I'm not saying you should sort of rush out and start doing this every day, but if you, because I'm feeling a slight hesitation in my saying it that way. But I'm also saying that it's accessible. This is the way Swamiji, makes it. It's accessible, it's not hidden. Isn't that funny? I'm suddenly like, am I not sure? I wonder what others say about this. But that has been my response. But I never thought about it as I'm expressing it right now, which is, I've expressed it in a very broad way, which I do feel confident in, but if I have to correct myself, I will. Okay. So now, here we are. We're in the third paragraph of this. And it says, O waves that we are on the bosom of the infinite sea, joyfully together, let us celebrate our own greater reality. Now, one of the very important concepts that Swami introduced when he introduced this ritual 30 years ago was to say together. Because one of the things that happens on the path of self-realization, where Kriya meditation is such a key part of it, where there's such an emphasis given to our individual capacity to have a relationship with God, sometimes we can become too isolated and we lose the power of bringing our thoughts and our hearts together. So we could just, waves that we are on the bosom of the infinite sea, let us celebrate our own greater reality. But Swami puts in the phrase, joyfully together. And so he wants us to recognize, that environment is stronger than willpower, as Master put it, and that if we consciously step into a spiritually supportive environment, it will greatly deepen our capacity to celebrate our own greater reality. Let us celebrate our own greater reality. And that phrase, too, over many years of having to communicate these teachings, and often, more so in the past, but still true, often being in a position where I was having to introduce people, where I had the opportunity to introduce people to the teachings when they may be very unfamiliar with them, especially if, it's the same in Eastern or Western countries, but to try to bridge from the lack of knowledge to the appreciation. And in the West especially, a lot of people are not religiously inclined. And some people, even who consider themselves spiritual, do not consider themselves deistic. This is a phrase that I learned somewhere along the line, which is the concept of God is not attractive. And they're at least agnostic, if not actively atheist, but yet they may want to learn to meditate because they've begun to understand that meditation is helpful. However, the way, if anyone ends up in the aura where I'm the one who's explaining it, meditation is a deistic practice. At least it's not a alone in my own mind practice. It's a relationship, is how I try to express it. But a relationship with what or with who? And people will sometimes, because they see the masters on the altar and they hear us praying, and yet, now this was especially true a number of years ago, when there were very few people teaching meditation. So if people wanted to learn meditation, where I lived, Ananda was the primary source, but it came with all this other stuff. So people would tell me that they didn't believe in God. So my question always was, well, what God do you not believe in? Because God is an abstraction. And people can have all these different definitions of it, but it's not inherent in the word. It's what you apply to the word. So most of the time, almost without exception, I didn't believe in the God they didn't believe in either, because it wasn't attractive. It was just a concept that couldn't hold my mind or my heart. And so I would agree that that was a concept worth rejecting. And then I'd have to start over to try to explain what I meant when I very comfortably and casually would use the word. But this phrase, greater reality, that we are part of a greater reality, is just a brilliant way to say it. Because it's saying that, the limits of my own mind, my own egoic self-definition, my culture, my body, my language, everything that makes me a singleton, a solitary, separate from everyone else, is that the actual definition of who I am? Or does this singleton exist in the context and in relationship to a greater reality? And I think when I try to think about the, the demographics of who will be part of Ananda, who will find Ananda to be a true home, there aren't a lot of externals, because we're of different ages, different ethnicities, countries, cultures, occupations, thousands of things. And they're all wildly varied. But everyone who is part of Ananda has come to understand, often before they arrive, that they are related to a greater reality. And you may feel it because you fall in love with your life partner, because you hold your newborn baby in your hand, because you adopt a puppy, because you go on a solitary hike, because you meet a tree, because you look at the heavens, because your life is miraculously spared when you should have died. But all of a sudden that the corners fracture, the edges fracture. And all of a sudden you just know that you're moving in a sea of something, greater reality. That's exactly it. And we want to explore that greater reality. And in the Festival of Light, because we're not trying to persuade, we're celebrating. And this is exactly what he says. Oh, waves that we are on the bosom of the infinite sea. So you start right there. Here's the great ocean of awareness, and I'm a wave on it. It's like, who am I? I know that I have this enduring individuality. For the first 10 years of my spiritual life, I lived in the monastery at Ananda village, and there were about 10 or a dozen of us women. There was a kind of changing parade of women around us, but there was a core of about maybe 10. I count it sometimes. I think it's less than 10, who were there from the beginning for most of that decade. And we had a little, we lived very primitively, in little trailers and a little cabin now and then. And our temple was a teepee, a canvas teepee. And it was a wonderful, wonderful little structure. And we went in there every morning, 6 days a week. We would go in there and meditate together. And I would joke about it, but it was a serious question for me. Because the unity of our consciousness over all those years became very deep. And even though at the end of 10 years we dispersed in lots of different directions, there's still something unique about the way that group is connected to itself. And I used to wonder when we would go in there and meditate, because there would be such a feeling of unity among us, but we would always walk out with the same self-identity. and it was only half a joke in my mind. How do it know? How do it know which one is me? And to pull the right segments out of it. But we always did. And of course, I'm being facetious about something that is a philosophical question. But from that meditation and from our life together over many years, which I say, even though we haven't lived in that proximity for 40 of my 50 years at Ananda, there's still something that ties me to each of those women. Because we were also part of a greater reality. And every time we came to meditate together, we would all just sort of cheerfully expand into upward from our limitation into the sphere where all those limitations were passed, because we all were individual waves, but we were all waves on the same cosmic sea. It's such a simple and so easily accessible image. The wave looks separate and seems to have its own separate, intention, but where does it come from? What is it made of? And I love how he puts it, joyfully we will celebrate our own greater reality. Because also, you see, that's the answer to the existential loneliness that is also integral to that individuality. I mean, it's very lonely being a wave. It's very scary being a wave, unless we know that we are just floating on the bosom of the infinite sea. And then we can frolic and dance and explore and expand, because we know that we are always just a part of that. Joyfully together, let us celebrate our own greater reality. And then he says, for now, by God's grace, our redemption is at hand. The promise has been given. The divine light returning anew to earth has given us power, as the Holy Bible proclaims, to become the sons of God. That is from the Gospel of John, to all who received him gave he the power to become the sons of God. Now it's very interesting. Swamiji integrates into this Festival of Light a few references from ancient Hindu tradition and a few references from the Christian tradition. But he doesn't identify any of them with either Christianity or Hinduism. He's going back to the essence of the ceremony has been passed down from ancient times. But because he knows, Swami knows, that a statement like this, even though it was written by St. John in reference to Jesus, is really the divine statement of how we awaken to our own greater reality. We receive the power of the masters, and that power awakens us. It helps us to escape from the horrible prison of our mistaken sense of isolation in this world. So he says, for now, by God's grace, our redemption is at hand. So now Swami is celebrating light, but he's also celebrating the fact that ever and again, through your awakened sons, this answer comes. Or let's go back to the Bhagavad Gita. Whenever virtue declines and vice predominates, I, the infinite spirit, take visible form in human form. So once again, avatars have descended. This is Swami's reference to ancient times. Now, he's not giving a course, so he's not explaining all that. That's what I'm explaining, all of this. He's just telling you the conclusions, and I'm giving you the context. And so we are celebrating the descent of Jesus Christ, Babaji, Lahiri Mahashaya, Sri Yukteswar Paramhansa Yogananda, as is enumerated later on in this festival. But we're not celebrating it as this unique in history moment. It's just ever again through your awakened sons. The answer comes. Whenever virtue declines and vice predominates, the Bhagavad Gita says, I, the infinite spirit, take visible form. So here we are again. That's what we're celebrating. Look, in this sea of Maya, once again, out of the grace of God, this line of masters has descended to help us realize our own divinity. So it's a moment in time, but it's not a unique moment in time, in the sense that this is always coming. And I keep saying the line that's coming later, ever and again through your awakened sons, the answer comes. And that is the light. That's the light we're celebrating. We're not celebrating the light as a pure abstraction. We're celebrating the light as it enters into our world. And then we're looking for how do we respond when that light enters. We celebrate our own greater reality, and Swami doesn't explain the whole of what John said, to all who received him. To them gave he the power. He just says the power is there, if we wish it. So, for now, by God's grace, our redemption is at hand. That also is quite a statement, isn't it? We're going to be redeemed. Redemption is a very funny word. It's a funny word. It's used a lot in the Christian tradition, but they speak of it as that we are inherently sinners and that God pays the price of our sin, which is also true. That gets complicated because the grace of God and the power of the Guru do dissolve our ignorance and make us free, so in that sense. But the Christian emphasis is that we are inherently sinners and have to be redeemed, whereas the Sanatana Dharma, the self-realization point of view, says that we are inherently divine, and all we have to do is brush a little bit of the mud off. But the problem is we mistakenly cling to our limitation because we don't realize that what we actually seek will be found only when we let that limitation go. And so we are redeemed from our ignorance because by the grace of God. Again, these get to be very long philosophical discussions, which I can go into, but I'm not going to go into at great length here. The way they simply put it is the ego can't dissolve itself. There has to be a force that comes in from a higher level of consciousness, and this is simply how everyone experiences it. There just comes a point in our own experience when we realize that we're part of a greater reality. That's really what it is. And all of a sudden you see that my independent willpower and self-determination and so on actually all exists as a wave on the bosom of the infinite sea. And it's the power of that, the mighty ocean underneath me is really who I am, not this tiny little wave that I draw around myself. The way masters describe it is if you have, it's actually 3 successive bottles, but if you have 3 bottles, ever smaller, and the inside one is filled with seawater, that first one can break, and that's your physical body. But then the seawater just expands into the second container, which is your astral body. And then that astral body breaks, but the seawater is still contained within the causal body. And when the causal body breaks, then we're liberated and we merge into the sea. Oddly enough, they say that our individuality can still always be extracted from the sea. We're still a unique bubble floating in the sea, but nothing separates us. And it's the breaking of those sheaths, as they sometimes call it, that is the whole process of self-realization. But we can't break it ourselves. There has to be a force coming in that causes us willingly to surrender. And we surrender it just like a little child. If a child is holding on to something that they really think is important, but then they see something that is more attractive, they'll just lose interest and reach for this. And when you're working with children, it often is better to redirect their energy to something else that they will be drawn to, rather than trying to rip out of their hands what they have become attached to now. And so the actual process of self-realization, and this is why it requires the grace of God, because we are sitting here clinging to whoever we think we are and what we think we must have in order to be happy. And then all of a sudden we see something so much more beautiful and we just forget. A woman friend of mine who went to visit a great woman saint in India said she and her friend were traveling in India by themselves for a long time and were extremely careful. Where is my passport? Where is my money? Where is my luggage? They just always knew where their important documents and things were, kept very close track of them, were never careless. They went into the ashram of this saint, and they just saw her and ran and sat at her feet. Hours later, they realized they had dropped their luggage, they had dropped their passports, they had dropped their money. They didn't even know, because they were just so attracted, they forgot everything else. That's the grace of God, you see. And that's how we become free. God bless you, my friends.